As Canada's ties with the United States fray, Prime Minister Mark Carney moves to strengthen ties with Europe. Carney has signed a strategic defence and security partnership with the European Union, an agreement that comes as Canada rewrites its relationship with the United States and works towards a new trade deal.
This summer, something unusual happened at the NATO summit. While President Trump pushed allies to ramp up defense spending and double down on tariffs, Canada did something else entirely. It signed a sweeping deal, not with the United States, but with the European Union. For Washington, it felt like a challenge, but for Ottawa, it was a calculated pivot. One that told the world, if America won't lead, we will find new partners who will. And at the center of this shift, a quiet but bold confrontation between two men, President Donald Trump and Prime Minister Mark Carney.
Carney and Trump have committed to reaching a trade deal by the middle of July.
He likes tariffs. He's said it many, many times. So we have to find a way to demonstrate that we can achieve the same goals with the United States, Canada, through other means that don't necessarily involve these punishing tariffs, especially on strategic goods.
The tensions didn't come out of nowhere. They had been building for months. Back in early March, Trump's administration imposed a 25% tariff on Canadian steel, along with a 10% tariff on energy exports. Branded as liberation tariffs, the White House claimed they were about fairness and national resilience. But in Canada, the move landed like a punch to the gut. For industrial towns like Hamilton or Sault Ste. Marie, places built on steel mills and energy plants, orders dried up. Layoffs spread. Between January and May 2025, Canada's manufacturing sector lost over 59,000 jobs, according to Statistics Canada. For Prime Minister Carney, a former central banker with a deep understanding of supply chains and capital flows, this wasn't just about diplomacy, it was about livelihoods, and he made that clear. If a deal with the US wasn't reached by July 21st, Canada would strike back. Ottawa outlined a clear position: remove the tariffs or face targeted countermeasures. The message was firm but calm. Trade should be fair, open, and reciprocal. But Washington wasn't budging. President Trump, in his typical fashion, signaled little interest in compromise. Tariffs, he said, worked. And negotiations? Only if Canada came to the table on his terms.
We are going to build trading relationships with like-minded partners, reliable partners, partners that are aligned with our values. It begins here.
So Carney pivoted, fast and deliberately. Days before the NATO summit in The Hague, he landed in Brussels and signed a strategic security and economic partnership with the European Union. The deal covered defense procurement, LNG cooperation, critical minerals, and a commitment to deepen digital trade infrastructure. For Canada, it wasn't just a show of independence. It was a structural move to diversify away from the American orbit. The partnership includes aligning Canada's industrial policy with that of Europe, working on new nuclear energy agreements, and developing rare earth supply chains together. German-built submarines and expanded naval integration were also on the table. At the same time, Canada pledged to meet NATO's 2% spending target and aim for 5% over the next decade, roughly $150 billion per year, according to projections by the Canadian Department of Finance. A large part of that would be invested in domestic resilience projects, like mining, port upgrades, and infrastructure to move Canadian minerals across the Atlantic. The goal? Reduce dependence on both the US and China, strengthen ties with Europe, and signal to Washington that Canada isn't waiting for permission to modernize. In Brussels, Carney stood shoulder to shoulder with EU leaders, echoing shared values: open trade, defense cooperation, rule of law. The optics were unmistakable. Back in Washington, officials didn't say much. But for those watching closely, the silence said it all. The Canada-EU deal wasn't a spontaneous reaction. It was months in the making, but its timing, just weeks before the US-Canada trade deadline, was no coincidence. As Carney tightened ties with Brussels, Trump doubled down on his tariff campaign. No mention of exemptions, no movement on steel or energy, just more pressure. But for Ottawa, this wasn't about retaliating with rhetoric. It was about reshaping the map. And while Washington may have underestimated Carney's quiet resolve, the next few weeks would test that strategy. day by day, because in 30 days, the clock would run out.
That they just don't think they can count on the United States to be a reliable partner on, because reliability got said a lot in this conversation.
As the dust settled from the NATO summit, two very different strategies became clear. Trump was still focused on bilateral deals, pushing his 90 deals in 90 days campaign, with vague announcements but few signed agreements. Meanwhile, Carney had already secured a long-term partnership with Europe and was preparing to confront Trump's tariffs head-on. But time was running out, and the stakes were rising. In Canada, economic pain was spreading beyond industrial towns. According to Statistics Canada, layoffs in the manufacturing sector hit a 5-year high by May. Supply chains slowed, investment stalled, and small businesses that depended on U.S. cross-border trade faced rising costs and falling demand. Communities like Windsor, Ontario, where auto parts flow south into Michigan, saw shifts canceled and plants idled. Carney faced growing political pressure to act fast. He met with provincial premiers, trade unions, and business leaders to craft a unified approach. The message was clear. The U.S. is still a key partner, but Canada can't wait indefinitely. Behind closed doors, Ottawa also explored expanding counter-tariffs. The Prime Minister signaled that measures could go up or down, depending on whether progress was made by July 21st. With the EU deal in hand and investor interest growing, Canada had options. European institutions, including the European Investment Bank and private pension funds, were reportedly eyeing Canadian infrastructure bonds, an indirect buffer against American pressure. Carney wasn't bluffing. He was building leverage.
So we are working nonstop, really 7 days a week on this. We've had 3 meetings. We're meeting again early next week. So it's, the pace is as fast as it can be. We're working as hard as we can.
The current round of U.S.-Canada negotiations is being led by Ambassador Kristen Hillman, alongside U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer. Meetings have taken place weekly since the G7 summit in Kananaskis. But progress has been slow. Hillman said publicly that both sides are working 7 days a week, but admitted that Canada cannot force the U.S. to act. Ottawa continues to push for tariff rollbacks, at least on strategic goods like steel and clean energy inputs. But so far, Washington hasn't budged. Analysts close to the White House say Trump is prioritizing a unified message for his 90 deals campaign and doesn't want to show weakness by backing down on tariffs, especially not to a close ally during a re-election year. Trump, preoccupied with his global tariff strategy and political messaging ahead of the midterms, appears unwilling to offer concessions. White House sources told Politico that the 30-day timeline was a Canadian proposal, not a U.S. commitment. But to Carney, that didn't matter. For him, the clock wasn't just diplomatic, it was political. Canadian workers couldn't wait, and neither could the economy. That's why Ottawa tied future counter-tariffs directly to the July 21st deadline. If no deal is signed, new measures will be triggered. That includes tariffs on select U.S. agricultural goods, aerospace components, and consumer exports. It's not a trade war Canada wants, but it's one it's now prepared for. Back in Washington, Trump continues to tout his economic agenda as bold, tough, and necessary. He claims tariffs are winning leverage, that America's partners will fall in line. But Carney's approach is changing the equation. By securing a new strategic anchor in Europe, Canada is no longer playing defense. It's writing a new playbook, one where American dependence is no longer assumed. With just weeks to go, both countries are watching, waiting, and preparing their next moves. Because whether a deal is signed or not, the U.S.-Canada relationship is no longer what it used to be. And no matter how this ends, one thing is clear. Mark Carney didn't wait for Trump to change his mind. He changed Canada's direction.
Yesterday, Prime Minister Mark Carney said that on July 21st, depending on how negotiations go with the United States over a new trade agreement, we'll make necessary adjustments on July 21st.
Donald Trump raised tariffs. Mark Carney didn't retaliate, at least not right away. Now, the 30-day clock is ticking. Canada and the U.S. have until July 21st to strike a new deal, or face another round of economic escalation. This isn't just about steel or aluminum. It's about control, strategy, and whether a former central banker can outmaneuver a sitting U.S. president at his own game. In early June, the Trump administration doubled tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, from 25% to 50%. It was the sharpest escalation since the so-called reciprocal tariff policy returned in April. Canada didn't hit back immediately. There were no matching retaliatory tariffs, no angry press conferences. Instead, Prime Minister Mark Carney announced that Canada would review its response by July 21st and adjust countermeasures based on progress in the negotiations. The date wasn't random. It marks exactly 30 days after Carney and Trump met briefly at the G7 summit in Alberta. There, both sides agreed to fast-track a trade agreement within a one-month window. Carney's decision to delay action was intentional. It gave Canada time to build leverage and put pressure on the U.S. to engage seriously without locking both sides into a tit-for-tat spiral too soon.
Speaking in Brampton, the Premier said he's confident there will be a fair trade deal between Canada and the U.S. within the next 27 days. But if not, Doug Ford insists Ontario will keep up the pressure on the Trump administration.
That doesn't mean Canada is staying quiet. Behind the scenes, the response is taking shape. In Ontario, Premier Doug Ford made clear that if Trump's tariffs continue, his province will impose more tariffs of its own. Ford emphasized that Canada buys more U.S. products than Japan, Korea, China, the UK, and Germany combined, and that Ottawa won't let that leverage go unused. At the federal level, Carney is moving on two fronts. First, Ottawa announced a new policy of reciprocal procurement, favoring Canadian suppliers for government projects involving steel and aluminum. This is designed to shield domestic industries and mirror the America First logic used by Trump. Second, the federal cabinet, including Intergovernmental Affairs Minister Dominic LeBlanc, has been holding closed-door meetings with U.S. officials to identify what they're calling key points for a deal. While details haven't been made public, Canadian officials have hinted the talks include tariffs, border infrastructure, and illicit trade, particularly fentanyl trafficking. The message is clear. Canada is building unity and preparing pressure points. But the final move depends on what happens in Washington. The July 21st deadline isn't just a political marker. It carries real economic consequences. If no agreement is reached, Canada is expected to raise tariffs on U.S. metals and possibly expand retaliation to other sectors. That could hit U.S. exporters just as the domestic manufacturing sector is already grappling with higher borrowing costs and weak consumer demand. The auto industry is particularly exposed. Canada is a key supplier of components and materials used in U.S. vehicle production. Any disruption to steel or aluminum flows could ripple through factories in Michigan, Ohio, and Illinois, many of them in politically sensitive regions. On the Canadian side, uncertainty is already weighing on investment. Industry groups say businesses are hesitant to expand or hire amid fears of tariff instability. Carney, for his part, has said little publicly. But insiders suggest the Prime Minister is working to balance pressure with pragmatism, giving Trump space to shift course while signaling that Canada won't wait forever.
We don't know what those details are. They've been pretty, tight-lipped on what specifically a new agreement could look like between Canada and the U.S., as to be expected.
As July 21st approaches, the question isn't just whether a deal can be made, but whether the delay was a mistake or a masterstroke. Trump moved first, but Carney held his move. Now, with the clock winding down, Canada's next step could shape not just the deal, but the future of North American trade diplomacy. In this showdown of tariffs and tactics, it may come down to who blinks first. And right now, neither side is blinking.